but this I considered indispensable for a Bolshevik commander. Looking back, I admit that at times I was too exacting, not always sufficiently restrained and tolerant of the faults of my subordinates. I could not bear to see any slackness in servicemen's work or behaviour. Some of them would not understand this, and I, for my part, was probably not tolerant enough of human frailties. Certainly I can see that a lot better now. Experience is a source of important lessons, but it is still my firm belief that no one has the right to lead an easy life at the expense of another's work. And that is something military people should particularly appreciate, for they are called upon to be the first to defend their country on the battlefield, unsparing of their lives. The 2nd Brigade, which I was to command, consisted of 2 cavalry regiments, the 39th and 40th. I would have to study the situation in the 40th Regiment, then commanded by Ivlev, a former Tsarist officer, and none too sociable a person. He had no heart for horsemanship, yet was well versed in fire training, to which he devoted much attention. In that respect, his regiment was always ahead of the others. Probably because of my long association with the 39th Regiment, whose men had become dear to me, I thought the 39th was better trained and better organised. I realised, however, that the commanders and political instructors of the 40th Regiment, attached as they were to their unit, would resent my setting the 39th as a model to be copied. Therefore, I sought to note and popularise in other units all that was good in the 40th Regiment, down to the smallest details. We often had demonstrative exercises of the 2 regiments in tactics, firing and horsemanship, and also in political education. This method soon proved effective. The 2nd Brigade became the leading one in the 7th Samara Division, as often noted by the command, which pleased all of us no end. In short, we all worked with enthusiasm, as one team. The commanders relied on the help of the party organisations and concentrated the energy of the men on improving their combat readiness. I could cite many examples, but I think that is unnecessary. I'll just mention what I remember best. One day, the party secretary of the 39th Regiment suggested that regiments compare notes about their work on the scale of the brigade. A joint meeting of the regiment's party bureaus decided to conduct a model political lesson with a group of soldiers to demonstrate how to explain to the politically most backward men the more involved issues of party policy. The first lesson was brilliantly conducted by B.A. Zhmurov, political instructor of a squadron of the 39th Regiment. Then, on the initiative of the political instructors of the 40th Regiment, the worst disciplined men were gathered to find out, in a frank talk, the reason for their misdemeanours. It turned out that many offences were committed not so much through the fault of the soldiers, but because their commanders and political instructors did not know their character and individual problems, and were often unfair in judging their behaviour. This was detrimental to their own prestige. The men often committed offences merely to annoy these superiors. These friendly talks were of much benefit both for the men and their commanders. In late 1929, I was sent to Moscow to attend a refresher course for higher-level commanders. We were put up at the Red Army Club Hotel and had our classes at the People's Commissariat for Defence in Frunze Street, where there were special classrooms and laboratories. The level of instruction was very high. In our group, lessons were conducted by Mikhail Sangursky, deputy to Blucher and a most knowledgeable man. His lectures on various aspects of warcraft were amply backed by examples from World War I and the Civil War. Other instructors were also accomplished experts in tactics and operational art. The trainees were all keenly interested in military theory. We hunted for every new book on the subject and collected everything we could lay our hands on to take back to our units. Soviet military science had already begun to take shape, and the leading place in it rightly belonged to the works of M.V. Frunze. In a collection of his works published in 1929, he elaborated on the correlation of man and technology in a future war, the nature of that war, the harmonious development of all arms of the service, and the role of the rear and the front. Frunze advocated having an integral military doctrine to define the character of the armed forces, the methods of combat training, and troop control on the basis of the prevailing views on the nature and methods of dealing with military tasks. Frunze made a profound generalization of the experience of the Civil War and proposed guidelines that later became the basis for regulations and manuals, without which the existence of the army of a new type, the Soviet Red Army, would be unthinkable. In the late 1920s, B.M. Shaposhnikov published a fundamental work, Brain of the Army, analyzing extensive historical material, giving a comprehensive appraisal of the role of the General Staff, and setting some important principles of military strategy. He also wrote the well-known books Cavalry and On the Vistula. I still think, as I did then, that the title Brain of the Army is quite wrong in reference to the Red Army. The Red Army's brain, from the outset, has been the party's central committee, since no major military question was ever tackled without it. The title is better suited for the old Tsarist army, whose general staff was, indeed, the army's brain. A.I. Yegorov wrote a number of important military historical works, including The Rout of Denikin. That was when M.N. Tukhachevsky, one of the most talented Soviet theorists, also began to publish his works. He came out with many far-sighted ideas on the nature of future wars, produced a profound study of the new tenets governing theory, tactics, strategy, and operational art, and showed the indissoluble link between military principles and practices on the one hand, and the social system and the country's production potential on the other. Stormy discussions erupted around the book of V.K. Triandafilov, Nature of Operations of Modern Armies, which immediately won broad popularity. The author expressed bold and profound views on the condition and prospects of the armies of that time, and outlined the principal ways of their technical equipment and organization. Triandafilov wrote this about the role of tanks in a future war. No one now questions the tactical significance of tanks in a future war. The current increase of automatic weapons in the infantry, the tendency of increasing the number and heightening the quality of these weapons, broad employment of artificial obstacles in defence, and the lag of the means of suppression, artillery, behind the defensive facilities make tanks one of the powerful offensive instruments in a future war. The second part of Triandafilov's work dealt with the operational art, data on the offensive and defensive capabilities of a division, a corps, an army, and an army group, as well as questions of approaching the battlefield, duration and depth of an operation, frontage of the offensive, defensive operations, etc. Most unfortunately, Triandafilov met a tragic death in an air crash in 1931 and did not complete his work on the problems of a future war and important principles of Soviet military strategy and operational art. There was a wealth of truly interesting material for every professional military man in the works of S.S. Kamenev, A.I. Kork, I.P. Uborovich, I.E. Yakir, and a few other leading commanders and theoreticians. In short, there was really a lot for us to take in, so much that we didn't have time for it all. A creative atmosphere reigned at our classes. We argued a great deal. I remember that who we argued with most was A.V. Gorbatov, a brigade commander in the 2nd Cavalry Corps. Gorbatov was a well-educated and most knowledgeable commander, and it was always interesting to draw him into a discussion. We thoroughly studied several important tactical and special topics, and familiarized ourselves with specimens of the latest weapons and equipment then being introduced in the Red Army. How was the Red Army technically equipped at the time? In 1920 to 1925, we had mainly to be content with the leftovers from the old Tsarist army, which had been quite backward. Industry was still unable to supply the Red Army with modern combat equipment, though everything possible was being done to improve the technical state of the army and navy. The Third All-Russia Congress of Soviets specially discussed the setting up of a dependable economic base for USSR defense and provision of the Red Army with new equipment. The Party Central Committee initiated the revision of old models of small arms, artillery and aircraft to select and perfect the best weapons. More funds were allotted for the technical equipment of the army, and metalworking factories, including those producing arms, were rehabilitated. From the very beginning, the party succeeded in making the construction of a Soviet Air Force and Navy a truly countrywide undertaking. In 1921, the Council of Labour and Defence passed a special resolution to work out a minimal programme for building an air fleet. Tens of millions of gold rubles were allocated. In the spring of 1923, a voluntary society of air fleet friends was formed. It collected 6 million gold rubles in 2 years, and over 300 military planes were built with that money. As a result, no more aircraft were bought abroad after 1925. Since 1922, the Komsomol has been the patron of the Soviet Navy. 3 voluntary drafts brought 8,000 Komsomols to the Navy. The Navy, which then consisted of the Baltic and Black Sea fleets, squadrons of warships on the Barents, Caspian and White Seas, and several lake and river flotillas, was brought back to strength and organizationally improved. The battleship Oktyabrskaya Revolyutsia, formerly Gangut, and 7 destroyers were modernized and overhauled in the Baltic. The cruiser Profintern was being completed, while the cruiser Chervona Ukraina and some 60 overhauled warships and auxiliary vessels were being recommissioned on the Black Sea. On the whole, the rehabilitation and modernization of the Soviet Navy was completed by 1928. Designers were called upon to develop new models of weapons. In 1924, the USSR Revolutionary Military Council approved the rules for the Commission on Military Inventions and its membership: SS Kamenev, MN Tukhachevsky, IS Unschlecht, and others. Several research and design institutions were set up. Prominent scientists Anne Krylov and S.A. Chapligin were consultants for Kosatop, Commission for Special Artillery Experiments. Experimental models of new Soviet planes and aircraft engines were developed at the famous TISAG, Central Institute of Aerodynamics, where N.N. Polikarpov and Tupolev and others built test models of fighters and bombers, among them the TB-1, which was superior to foreign planes of its type. K.A. Tsiolkovsky and F.A. Tsander made an outstanding contribution in the field of jet propulsion and space navigation, while talented inventors such as N.I. Tikhomirov, F.V. Tokarev, and others were given every assistance in the field of firearms. In 1927, V.A. Degtyaryov and V.G. Fyodorov developed a new light machine gun, which was superior to foreign designs in quality. At the same time, the development of the 76mm regimental gun and an anti-aircraft gun took place. However, taken in general, the Red Army of the 1920s was poorly equipped. This was due to the country's economic difficulties and the insufficient development of the war industry. The army was short of heavy and light machine guns, and there was no automatic rifle as of yet. The old 7.62 LMM rifle needed modernization, and the artillery was obsolete and badly worn out. By the end of the 1920s, there were only 7,000 artillery pieces, mostly light guns. Anti-aircraft, tank, and anti-tank artillery were non-existent. By 1928, the USSR had only 1,394 military aircraft, mostly of older models, and about 100 tanks and armoured cars. The army was poorly motorized, with only 350 trucks, 700 passenger cars, and 67 crawler tractors by the end of 1928. It should be remembered, however, that until 1928, the USSR had neither an automobile nor a tractor industry. Meanwhile, the big imperialist powers were building up their armed forces at crash rates. In the event of a war, Britain could turn out 2,500 tanks a month, and France 1,500. Their air forces numbered tens of thousands of planes, and their troops were being quickly motorized. Our recent and potential adversaries were far ahead in armaments compared to the First World War. When comparing these data, one marvels at the immense difference in starting points, objectively determined by history, at which we began our competition with the capitalist world. Legitimate pride takes hold of me in the social system that enabled us to catch up with and outstrip the military establishments of the most advanced world powers in an astonishingly short time. And I feel pride in the people and army that later were able to crush the most powerful imperialist opponent. It was clear that only large-scale industry could provide the Red Army and Navy with up-to-date arms. Industrialization was the only way to ensure the defensive capacity of the Soviet Union. Technology was crucial, and our military leaders at that time were well aware of it. They had the right perspective on the nature and specific features of future war. As early as 1925, M.V. Frunze said the following in his report to the January plenary meeting of the Russian Communist Party's Central Committee on the results of the military reform. Many of our comrades, especially those, I believe, who have fought in the Civil War, probably think in terms of the Civil War era. I make bold to declare that these sentiments are very dangerous, because a future war will not in the least resemble the Civil War. Of course, it will be in the nature of a class civil war in the sense that there will be white guards on the enemy's side, and that we too will have allies in the enemy camp, but it will be quite unlike our Civil War both in arms and methods. We will face a superb army equipped with all the latest technical improvements, and if our army lacks these improvements, our prospects may prove most unfavourable. This should be kept in mind when we deal with the question of the country's general preparations for defence. In the spring of 1930, we finished our courses and returned to our units. I commanded the 2nd Cavalry Brigade for over a year, and I must say that I learned a great deal and augmented my knowledge of both theory and practical matters. Towards the end of 1930, I learned that I was being considered for the post of Assistant Cavalry Inspector of the Red Army. Although the inspectorate's activity was highly esteemed in the cavalry, I must confess that I was not happy at the news. I had grown attached to the 7th Samara Division and considered myself an indispensable member of that friendly family. However, the matter was settled, and I had to start packing for Moscow. There wasn't much to pack, just a greatcoat and a few changes of underwear. All our family belongings fit into one suitcase. None of us commanders had any other property, and that was considered entirely normal. One evening, Rokossovsky called and informed me that Moscow had appointed me to the new post. "How long will you take to get ready?" he asked. "No more than 2 hours," I replied. "We can't let you go like that," Rokossovsky said. "After all, you are a veteran of the 7th Division, and we will see you off properly. That is the general wish of the commanders and political instructors of the 2nd Brigade." I was greatly moved. A couple of days later, a dinner was held by the commanders and the political staff of the 39th and 40th Cavalry Regiments, with divisional commanders also present. Many kind and heartfelt words were addressed to me, which I have remembered all my life. The next morning I was ready to leave. Before departing, I visited Minsk, a city I had grown fond of after living there for 8 years. My late wife, Alexandra, my 2-year-old daughter, Era, and I left for Moscow that evening. 2 years later, the 15th Party Congress issued the following directive for the first 5-year plan. Considering the possibility of a military attack on our proletarian state by capitalist powers, it is necessary in the 5-year plan to pay the utmost attention to the rapid development of those branches of the economy in general, and industry in particular, which play the leading part in ensuring the country's defences and economic stability in wartime. Here I would like to digress a bit. On the whole, the nations of the world recognise that it was Soviet soldiers and Soviet arms that saved Europe from the Brown Plague, and that the defeat of Nazi Germany was the greatest historic feat of the Soviet people. I think that the foundation for this was laid when the Soviet people responded to the call of the party and began industrializing their country. I do not have the requisite data at hand, nor is it my purpose, to make a comprehensive analysis of the importance of industrialization for the development of the economy, improving the life of the people, strengthening the collective farm system, etc. As for the armed forces and the outcome of the fight for freedom and independence in the Great Patriotic War, they directly depended on the rate of industrialization and its effective implementation. We might have delayed the steep rise in heavy industry for some 5 or 7 years and given the people more consumer goods more quickly. Our people had earned this 1,000 times. This was certainly a most seductive option. But had we done so, who can tell how that grimmest period, which we call the initial period of the war, would have ended? Where, before what city or on what river, would the fascist troops have been stopped? The wisdom and acumen of the party, which history itself has qualified as correct, the rightly chosen path of development, and the heroism shown by the people at their work in those years laid the foundation for our victories in the Second World War. The 16th and 17th Party Congresses pointed to the steadily increasing danger of war and firmly demanded that the effort of the people be concentrated on enhancing the power of the Red Army and Navy. A specific directive was issued to step up industrial development, especially of the iron and steel industry, to accumulate state reserves and to radically modernize transport. It was decided to expand the mobilization capacity of the entire economy, to locate and build industrial units so that, in the event of an enemy attack, industry could be quickly geared to military production and the mobilization plan. Besides the communists of the Cavalry Inspectorate, our party branch included communists from other inspectorates, those of infantry and fire training, artillery, signals and engineers, the Division of Combat Training, and other divisions of the People's Commissariat. We did our best to gear the personnel of the inspectorates and divisions to carry out the tasks set by the party, the government, and the People's Commissar. The People's Commissariat for the Army and Navy, and its leading corps of party members, was then occupied with a number of important matters. Here are some of them. The military reform in the Red Army and Navy was completed. Considerable changes had been brought about in the armed forces. The whole process of training was improved, the troops were better disciplined, and the principle of one-man command had been enforced at all levels. Conditions were created to perfect the skill of commanders. In the middle of 1929, the Central Committee of the party adopted a resolution on the state of USSR defense. It stated that its policy aimed at the radical technical reconstruction of the Army, Air Force, and Navy. While modernizing the existing equipment, the USSR Revolutionary Military Council and the People's Commissariat for the Army and Navy were instructed to develop experimental samples and thereafter introduce on a mass scale modern types of artillery, chemical defense equipment, and armored vehicles, as well as launch serial production of new types of aircraft and engines. This resolution formed the basis of the first 5-year military development plan. Among other things, this plan envisaged activating new technical arms, motorizing and reorganizing the old arms, training technical personnel in large numbers, teaching the entire personnel the use of new arms. In January 1931, the USSR Revolutionary Military Council finalized the schedule of measures for 1931 to 1933, thus completing the elaboration of the first 5-year military development plan. In view of the new tasks, some important changes were introduced in the central military apparatus. For instance, a chief of armaments was instituted in charge of the technical modernization of the army. The post was held by Ip Uborevich until 1931, and after that by Mn Tukhachevsky. In 1929, a division for the mechanization and motorization of the Red Army was formed under the People's Commissariat for the Army and Navy, headed by I.A. Kalepsky and K.B. Kalinovsky, who were great enthusiasts and experts in tank building. Armor sections were organized in the military districts. Up until 1929, we had practically no tank building industry, nor any designers and engineers for it. Still, the party and government were aware that armour would play an important role in any future war. They set the military establishment the relevant tasks. The USSR Revolutionary Military Council issued a special directive which envisaged the building of various types of fighting machines: baby tanks, medium tanks, heavy tanks, and bridge-laying tanks. Their characteristics and performances were defined, and very soon Soviet designers developed new models of tanks. Between 1931 and 1935, the Red Army received T-27 baby tanks, T-24 and T-26 light tanks, high-speed BT tracked tanks, T-28 medium tanks, T-35 heavy tanks, T-37 amphibious baby tanks. Under the first 5-year plan, the industry turned out nearly 4,000 tanks and baby tanks. The Soviet military command promptly drafted a new development plan for the Red Army's Air Force. In early 1930, the Revolutionary Military Council endorsed a program for developing various types of land-based aircraft, seaplanes, air balloons, and aerial photography equipment, with emphasis on bomber and fighter aviation. In 2 years, an organizational plan for the Air Force was launched where strategic, tactical, and operational problems were considered from the viewpoint of national defense in the event of an attack. Long-range bombers were organized into large air units capable of independent operational missions. A year later, these large units of heavy bombers were merged into corps. The Red Army's Cavalry Inspectorate worked in close contact with the Combat Training Division. There I first met Alexander Mikhailovich Vasilevsky, with whom I worked a lot during the Great Patriotic War as representatives of the Supreme Command. Vasilevsky was a first-class specialist already at the time, having studied the specifics of military training during his many years as a regimental commander. He was greatly respected in the division. A.J. Lapin, who headed the Combat Training Division, and his successor A.I. Sediakin also contributed greatly. In the summer of 1931, the Central Committee of the party adopted a resolution on the Red Army's command and political personnel, which summed up the major achievements and shortcomings in education and combat training. Special attention in the resolution was given to extending the program of technical training, increasing the number of higher-level engineers and technicians, and improving political education. By then, the general system of training Red Army commanders had essentially been worked out. As for standard military schools, stress was laid on air, tank, artillery, and technical service schools. The number of trainees increased twofold. In 1924, their number was about 25,000. To extend the training of senior commanders, it was decided to convert the respective departments of the Military Technical Academy into the Military Academy of Mechanization and Motorization, the Artillery Academy, the Academy of Chemical Defense, the Military Academy of Electrical Engineering, the Academy of Military Engineers. It was also decided to found a new Military Transport Academy and to considerably expand enrollment at the M.V. Frunze Military Academy and the Military Political Academy. Thus, the number of higher military educational establishments was boosted by 50%, while the student body grew from 3,200 in 1928 to 16,500 in 1932. The Combat Training Division based all its work on the latest directives of the party. It was aware that the fighting efficiency of the army depended above all on knowledge of the new equipment and the intricacies of modern warfare. Scores of measures were developed and implemented, aimed at training personnel not only at military educational establishments and various refresher courses, but also during intensive combat training within military units. By that time, nearly all of the commanders had a specialized military education. Training time for commanders was 42 hours a month instead of 6-8 in 1929. Along with tactical and fire training, much attention was devoted to technical training under an obligatory minimum program for each arm and each category of commander. Courses in new equipment and weapons were introduced for commanders in reserve during their refresher training rallies. Important work was being done by the staff of the Artillery Inspectorate under Artillery Inspector N.M. Rogovsky, an expert artilleryman who was greatly respected by the troops. Commanders of military districts and formations, as well as artillery engineers, sought his advice. The individuals responsible for artillery faced numerous complex problems. Many of the guns were significantly worn out and outdated, primarily inherited from the old Russian army. However, in the middle of 1929, the USSR Revolutionary Military Council developed a 5-year program to re-equip Red Army artillery. This program aimed to enhance the firepower, rate, range, and accuracy of artillery fire. Large artillery design bureaus were established, and the construction of ordnance factories commenced. These factories would eventually produce modernized artillery systems and their corresponding ammunition. Additionally, the training of engineers and technicians began. Between 1928 and 1933, the capacity of ordnance factories increased more than 6-fold, and the production of small-caliber guns grew 35 times over. By the end of my tenure at the People's Commissariat for Defense, work had begun on drafting the second 5-year plan for Red Army development, covering the period from 1934 to 1938, The party's primary directive was to complete the technical rebuilding and re-equipment of the armed forces. This involved large-scale implementation of decisive means for repelling aggression, such as aircraft, tanks, and artillery. In accordance with this party directive, the Council of Labour and Defence adopted a programme to strengthen the Navy from 1933 to 1938, approved a resolution for equipping the Red Army with artillery during the second five-year plan, and outlined an Air Force development plan for 1935 to 1937. Speaking of the People's Commissariat for Defence in the early 1930s, I must mention the activity of its Central Party Bureau, which efficiently guided our party organisations and enjoyed considerable prestige. All central divisions of the People's Commissariat and the Red Army Inspectorates worked diligently, with initiative and energy. Classes in Marxism-Leninism, general education, and cultural work were well organised. Party meetings were lively, with frequent criticism from the floor. At that time, the Red Army's Cavalry Inspectorate held great prestige among cavalry units. In addition to its inspection duties, it organised field and staff exercises, war games, and various rallies to facilitate the exchange of combat training know-how. Generally, the cavalry led the way in combat training, and it was no accident that the best cavalry commanders were assigned to new arms of the service, notably tank and motorised units. In my role at the Inspectorate, I participated in drafting regulations and manuals for various arms and services. Exceptional importance was attached to the content of these Red Army regulations, which reflected the latest military science developments, aligned with the level of technical advancements, and accounted for changes in military operations. The armed forces received their first set of manuals in 1924, 1925, summarising the lessons of World War I, the Civil War, and the subsequent military reforms. In 1929, the Temporary Field Service Regulations, Part 2, introduced the concept that battles were combined arms operations, requiring cooperation between all arms. The regulations detailed tactics for incorporating armour, organising anti-tank, air and chemical defences, and utilising aviation and engineer troops. Over time, new regulations and manuals were issued, replacing or supplementing those from 1924-1925. These included the Temporary Field Camouflage Manual, Combat Regulations for the Air Force, Telephony and Telegraphy Manual, and the Underwater Mining Manual. By the mid-1930s, the Red Army had developed an advanced military doctrine, as encapsulated in a system of competent regulations and manuals. In 1931, A.I. Yegorov became chief of the Red Army staff. Although the Cavalry Inspectorate had limited interaction with the staff, we knew that the personnel were pleased with Yegorov's appointment. Alongside M.N. Tukhachevsky, who was then first deputy to the People's Commissar, and V.K. Triandafilov, a talented military theorist, they capably assisted K.E. Voroshilov, the People's Commissar for Defence. As a staff member of the Cavalry Inspectorate, I became more acquainted with Mikhail Tukhachevsky. I first met him during the suppression of the Antonov-Kulak revolt in 1921. Tukhachevsky was an impressive figure, athletic, courageous, and highly knowledgeable about military science. He had a keen understanding of how various arms could be utilized in modern warfare, and brought a creative approach to all military problems. Tukhachevsky often emphasized the decisive influence of rapid scientific and technical development on the organization of armed forces and future warfare. He was particularly concerned with Germany, warning in the 1930s that it was preparing for a major war, which would likely be directed against the USSR. He highlighted Germany's development of a powerful invasion army consisting of strong air and airborne forces, mechanized infantry, and armour. In the summer of 1931, while at the field camps of the 1st Cavalry Corps, I worked on drafting the service regulations for the Red Army Cavalry. After thorough discussions within the Inspectorate, the regulations were presented to Tukhachevsky for his input. His amendments greatly improved our draft, and the service regulations were adopted, providing the cavalry with an excellent combat training manual. The last time I saw Tukhachevsky was in 1931 at a party meeting, where he delivered a compelling report on the international situation. He spoke about the growing strength of our country and the broad prospects for its socialist economy, science, engineering, and culture. Tukhachevsky was an intellectual force in military thinking and one of the Red Army's greatest commanders. In 1936, addressing the second session of the Central Executive Committee of the USSR, Tukhachevsky once again warned about the danger posed by Nazi Germany. He backed his speech with a thorough analysis of Germany's military potential and aggressive intent. The Cavalry Inspectorate revised the organizational structure of cavalry units, armaments, and combat methods. A cavalry division now consisted of 4 cavalry regiments, a mechanized regiment, and an artillery regiment, among other technical and fire support elements. The Red Army cavalry was thus better equipped for combat, enabling it to conduct its own firepower and tank attacks, significantly enhancing its ability to penetrate and crush enemy defenses. The theory of deep penetration was a significant achievement of Soviet military strategy, involving the coordinated use of tanks, aircraft, artillery, and paratroops. This strategy sought to break through enemy defenses with a concentrated strike and quickly follow up with mechanized troops to defeat the enemy. Throughout my work with the Cavalry Inspectorate, we placed great importance on cavalry rearmament and combat readiness, especially since many cavalry units were stationed near strategic frontiers. One day, I was summoned by I.D. Kosogov, first deputy to the chief cavalry inspector, who informed me that I had been recommended to Voroshilov for the position of commander of the 4th Cavalry Division. Kosogov sounded me out on whether I would like going to the Byelorussian military district. I said I considered the appointment as commander of such a famous division a special honor. I knew the district well, I said, having worked there earlier for some 10 years. I was acquainted with L.Y. Weiner, commander of the 3rd Cavalry Corps, whom I respected as a seasoned soldier. Kosogov then informed me that Budeny would see me on this matter. This occurred several days later, after the People's Commissar had signed my new posting. Parting with me, Budeny observed in a voice packed with emotion, "The 4th Division has always been a crack division, and so it must remain. It gives me pleasure to say that we achieved this after a dedicated effort by the commanders, the political workers, and the party organization. Since Budeny has so excellently described the spectacular victories of the 4th Cavalry Division in his book, The Glorious Path, I will confine myself to a few of my own recollections going back to the time when I was in command of this fine division. Named after K. Voroshilov, it was the nucleus of the legendary 1st Mounted Army. In bitter Civil War battles, it displayed courage beyond compare and mass heroism. Up to 1931, the division was quartered in the Leningrad military district, Gatchina, Peterhof, and Detskoye Selo, in places where the cavalry guards had been stationed before the revolution. The glorious traditions that the division had created during the Civil War were carried forward in peacetime. It preserved them jealously and instilled in recruits a lofty sense of responsibility and military duty. In 1932, the division was rushed to Slutsk in the Byelorussian military district. As I learned later, the move had been prompted by what were said to be operational reasons, though there was at the time not the slightest need for it. Since the quarters in Slutsk were totally unprepared, the division had to waste some 18 months building its own barracks, stables, headquarters, dwellings, depots, and other facilities. As a result, a splendidly trained division was reduced to an inefficient labor force. What made matters worse was that shortages of building materials, the rainy weather, and other unfavorable factors precluded timely preparation for the winter's cold, affecting morale and combat worthiness. Discipline grew lax, and the disease incidence among the horses increased. The command of the 3rd Corps, of which the 4th Cavalry Division was part, could offer no help, as its other formations had likewise been rushed to the military district and were in the same plight. In the spring of 1933, I.P. Uborovich, who was then in charge of the Byelorussian military district, made a brief visit of inspection and found the 4th Cavalry Division in a frightful state. Previously, it is true, he had not assisted it in construction and did not take the conditions faced by the division into consideration. Now he hastened to put all the blame on G.P. Kletkin, the division commander. It goes without saying that the commanding officer is responsible for the division, being its sole authority. But his superior officer should, by virtue of his office and as a senior comrade, have been more objective. Hot-tempered Uborovich, however, notified Voroshilov, then People's Commissar for Defence, demanding immediate demotion of the CO of the 4th Cavalry Division, G.P. Kletkin. Though there were indeed shortcomings in evidence, Uborovich had laid it on too thick, saying the division was not combat-worthy and had squandered all its previous fine traditions. K. Voroshilov found Uborovich's message a most bitter pill to swallow. After all, he had been associated with the division for many years and had more than once led it into attack. It had raised a whole constellation of gifted commanders and political workers. Chief Cavalry Inspector Boudeni, too, had a warm spot in his heart for this division, which he had helped to organize and had also led into battle. Voroshilov briefed Boudeni on Uborovich's report and asked him to suggest a new man for divisional commander. Then came the day when my wife, my daughter and I boarded the train for those familiar places in Byelorussia. I knew Byelorussia well and was fond of it, its picturesque scenery, its lovely woods, lakes and rivers. The hunter and angler that I was happy to return to these wonderful parts. During my previous term of service in Byelorussia, I had a very good idea of the terrain throughout, from north to south. Oh, how useful this proved later, and what mattered most to me was that I had many friends there, especially in the cavalry. True, I had little knowledge of the 4th Division, having visited it but once in 1931, and even then very briefly. I hardly knew anyone there, with the exception of Divisional Commander Kletkin, his deputy for political affairs N.A. Jung, the Chief of Staff A.I. Vertogradsky, commander of the mechanized regiment V.V. Novikov, and a few other officers. Yet when one does not know one's subordinates, their merits, faults and abilities, one cannot count on success, especially in command of a large unit. In Slutsk, spring had played havoc with the roads. We found ourselves amidst a sea of mud, and my wife lost her galoshes several times before we got to the carriage. My little girl, whom I carried, asked, "Why don't they have pavements here as they do at home in Sokolniki?" I replied, "We'll also have pavements and a lovely square here, but later." For living quarters, we had to be content provisionally with a very small room, which the Divisional Chemical Defence Chief, Dvortsov, kindly placed at our disposal, moving out with his family to just one small room. We put up with this because we knew how difficult the housing situation was, and that we could not ask for anything better until we had built it ourselves. Half an hour later, I called at the Divisional HQ across the courtyard. Divisional Commander Kletkin was out. I was told he was feeling unwell and would not be able to receive me. I could easily guess his state of mind and did not insist on seeing him at once. I was briefed on the situation in the division by Nikolai Jung, the Deputy Commander for Political Affairs, and Alexander Vertogradsky, the Divisional Chief of Staff, for whose laconic but thorough account I was most grateful. But I still had to study the situation in the units on the spot, size up the shortcomings, discover their causes, and work out, in collaboration with the command personnel and political workers, the way of remedying them. That day I also called on the 19th Manich Cavalry Regiment, the oldest in the division, whose commander, Fyodor Kostenko, was a veteran of Boudeni's 1st Mounted Army. Though I did not know him personally, I had heard much of this conscientious commander, that he was a cavalry enthusiast who invariably participated in all equestrian contests, then quite common in the cavalry. When the Great Patriotic War broke out, Kostenko was commanding the 26th Army, which defended our frontiers in Ukraine. The men under his command put up such stubborn resistance that, suffering heavy losses, the Nazis failed to penetrate into Ukraine in those early days of the war. Regrettably, he and his favourite elder boy Pyotr were killed in the bitter fighting at Kharkov when he was deputy commander of the Southwestern Front. I remember that when still at school, Pyotr Kostenko had most diligently applied himself to military studies, being particularly fond of riding and swordsmanship. Kostenko was proud of his boy and hoped he would make a fine cavalry commander one day. His hopes came true. Later, I acquainted myself closely at first hand with the situation in the 20th, 21st and 23rd Cavalry Regiments, the 4th Mounted Artillery Regiment and the 4th Mechanized Regiment, and then in the divisional squadrons. I found the 20th Regiment, then quartered in the village of Konyuki, 20 kilometers from Slutsk, in a most deplorable plight. Its commander at the time was V.V. Krykov, the selfsame man who in the past war commanded a cavalry corps that was mentioned more than once in the orders of the Supreme Commander. The regiment was stationed near the state frontier and was, as it were, the division's vanguard. However, despite the privations, morale was high. Even the officers' wives, who had but recently parted with good flats outside Leningrad, did not grumble. They only complained that there were no schools hereabouts for the children. The commander of the 21st Regiment was in Muzichenko, a man I had known from the 14th Separate Cavalry Brigade, in which he had been Assistant Military Commissar during the Civil War. When the Great Patriotic War broke out, he was commanding the 6th Army in Ukraine and had his headquarters in Lvov. For a number of reasons, he had had bad luck when the war began. Heavily outnumbered by the enemy, he was compelled to retreat to the Ukrainian hinterland. Heavily wounded, he was taken prisoner, and for the duration of the war languished in POW camps in Germany. The 21st Cavalry Regiment produced a somewhat better impression. It was well organized, the men looked smart, and there was general good order. One could feel the command personnel and political workers had been doing good work. The commander of the 23rd Cavalry Regiment was Elen Sakovich. This was a man of unimpeachable honesty, a self-disciplined man deeply loyal to the Communist Party and a brave soldier. He laid down his life on May 27, 1942, in the Kharkov operation, in command of the 28th Cavalry Division. The commander of the 4th Mechanized Regiment was V.V. Novikov, who in the war was in command of a mechanized corps, receiving mention more than once in the orders of the Supreme Commander. A veteran of the 1st Mounted Army, he was for some time Operations Chief of the 4th Cavalry Division. His commissar in the 4th Mechanized Regiment was A.S. Zinchenko, also a veteran of the 1st Mounted Army, who had been with it ever since it was formed. In the past war, he served as commissar at a number of major frontline hospitals. In this regiment, there grew up many fine commanders and political workers who later held high office at the General Staff, in the central divisions of the Defence Ministry, and with the troops. Factory hands or peasants before, they became prominent military experts, senior officers, and generals. Since mechanized units, especially at corps level, played an outstanding role in the Great Patriotic War, while the formation of mechanized army corps did not go at all smoothly before the war, I would like to say a few words about the history of mechanized corps to show that the Soviet Army had pioneered this branch of the service. In 1929, the USSR Revolutionary Military Council took a decision on the basis of a report by Triandafilov, which said, "In view of the fact that armoured forces are a new type of weapon that has not been studied sufficiently from the point of view of its tactical employment, independently and in conjunction with infantry and cavalry, and the best forms of its organisation, it is necessary to form a permanent experimental mechanized unit in 1929 to 1930. An experimental mechanized regiment was formed accordingly in the same year. In 1929, it took part in the army exercises in our Byelorussian military district, which were conducted by Voroshilov, Shaposhnikov, and Triandafilov. In 1930, the regiment was made a mechanized brigade and immediately took part in military district exercises. In 1932, we formed the world's first mechanized corps, consisting of 2 mechanized brigades, 1 rifle and machine gun brigade, and an anti-aircraft battalion. It had over 500 tanks and more than 200 other armoured vehicles. By 1936, we had 4 mechanized corps, 6 separate mechanized brigades, 6 separate tank regiments, 15 mechanized regiments as part of cavalry divisions, and over 80 tank battalions and companies as part of rifle divisions. The activation and practical testing of the first mechanized formations provided a solid foundation for developing the theory of broad employment of mechanized troops. We began the inspection of the 4th Mechanized Regiment by alerting the men. Its command personnel had not expected this, of course, as the regiment had only just completed its move from the Leningrad military district. Initially, we explained to the unit commanders that the main priority for a mechanized regiment was to deploy the unit quickly, to handle the new armour expertly, and to master the special art of firing from tanks. As could have been expected, this alert, which occurred on a rainy night, revealed many shortcomings, particularly in driving tanks on unfamiliar terrain and in gunnery. During on-the-spot inspections, I became thoroughly acquainted with the divisional HQ and the unit commanders and political workers. In both the divisional headquarters and the political department, there were several shortcomings in practical administration. Control of combat training, for example, was inadequate. Commanders were not demanding enough in ensuring that all orders were carried out promptly. The analysis, generalization, and dissemination of progressive combat training know-how were poorly organized. As a result, each unit stewed in its own juice, leading to cases where a unit was discovering something, a new method of training, for example, that some other unit had long since been using. The divisional chief of staff was A.I. Vertogradsky, a knowledgeable military expert who had been an officer in the Tsarist army before the revolution. Heading the political department was a most capable political officer, N.A. Jung, who was soon promoted to the post of Deputy for Political Affairs of the commander of the 3rd Cavalry Corps and left for Minsk. After summing up the results of the inspection with the divisional command, we decided to convene a meeting of party activists to discuss all merits and faults in the life of the division. Following that, we would call a broad conference of the entire command personnel, to which unit NCOs would also be invited, as their role in organising all affairs was exceptionally significant. The meeting of party activists was a success. Speakers expressed intolerance for shortcomings and rebuffed those who tried to excuse lax discipline and the poor standard of training as being due to objective reasons. It was clear that the general backsliding in the division was linked to poor political work and combat training, which had been almost completely suspended as everything had been concentrated on construction. A balanced system of combat training had to be reintroduced at once, and full-scale party political work needed to restart. As for building and other day-to-day matters, these issues were to be addressed on specially designated days in the plan. Furthermore, we hoped to receive a much larger measure of assistance from the Military District Command than we had thus far. The opinions of the party meeting and the proposals made by the divisional command were well received and supported by the conference of the command personnel and political workers. In terms of combat training, we intended to focus on methodical training for all echelons of the command personnel. Regarding tactical training, we committed to conducting a series of demonstration exercises. The 21st Regiment was asked to provide a demonstration in fire training, while the 19th Regiment, led by F. Yar Kostenko, a fine horseman, was to give equestrian demonstrations. Vivi Krybkov undertook to provide demonstrations in marching drill and physical training. The 23rd Regiment was ordered to prepare and conduct briefings on NCO training, while the 4th Mounted Artillery and 4th Mechanized Regiments were instructed to hold exercises in coordinating artillery and armour with cavalry in offensive operations. Much methodical and organisational work lay ahead, as good results could only be expected if the exercises were of a superior standard and impressed the audience. In tactical training, we concentrated on the personal training of the medium and senior echelons of the command personnel. Past experience and my many years in the army had convinced me that only tactically well-grounded commanders could train combat-ready units in peacetime and win battles in wartime with minimal losses. I must once again emphasize that I personally have always considered tactical training the most critical aspect of combat training overall, and I have maintained this approach throughout my many years in the army, from private to Minister for Defence. The division allotted most of its training time to field exercises, emphasizing the organization and conduct of combat under complicated conditions. Lightning marches to the forming-up place and the acute situations that arose greatly benefited the command personnel. We ensured that the commanders and political workers learned to organize and direct units in battle, as without this, it is impossible to defeat the enemy in the dynamic modern combat. At that time, the cavalry was the most mobile arm of the ground forces. It was intended for quick flanking and enveloping movements and thrusts into the enemy's flanks and rear. In meeting engagements, it had to be capable of rapid deployment, opening fire quickly, rushing its main forces to assault positions, and pursuing the retreating enemy. The reinforcement of cavalry with armour and the equipment of mounted artillery regiments with howitzers provided possibilities not only for crushing enemy resistance, but also for successfully conducting offensive and defensive operations. To be sure, the introduction and employment of new technical facilities did not always go smoothly due to the low educational level of many soldiers and commanders, numerous breakdowns and technical snags. Not all the men realized the need for technical knowledge, and there was a shortage of specialists. Old arms of the service had to be reorganized, new formations activated, and infantry and cavalry commanders retrained as flyers and tankmen, all while maintaining combat readiness to repel possible aggression. The organization of the troops was changing alongside this. On the other hand, the new equipment attracted the men with its promise of new possibilities and evoked interest among the mass of servicemen. Military technical knowledge was widely popularized in the press, on the radio, and through cinema. Under the guidance of party organizations, commanders and men studied in countless military technical circles. Nearly 80% of the personnel in our military district attended such circles in 1932, while their total number for the Army and Navy was about 5,000. Servicemen attended lectures and reports on military technical subjects and participated in contests for the best knowledge of equipment and weapons. Everywhere in the units, Komsomol members set up stands and photographic displays to popularize technical knowledge. They organized meetings to discuss the best maintenance methods for the latest military technical books, set up exhibitions of equipment, and launched a mass drive for the title of Excellent Marksman. With the help of the Central Committee of the Young Communist League and various voluntary defense societies, young people of conscription age quickly learned how to use military equipment. In 1934 and 1935, over 1.5 million young men and women passed tests in knowledge of the internal combustion engine and 1 million in anti-aircraft and chemical defense. In short, promoting the party's call to learn all things technical was the primary concern of party, trade union, and Komsomol organizations in the army, as well as of commanders and political workers. Commanders and men learned to use the equipment and often made improvements to it. In 1933, over 4,000 such improvements were made in our military district alone. This activity was naturally encouraged in every way. We considered it a key task to teach command and staff personnel to direct operations in conditions of surprise meeting engagements. This required moving away from orders and instructions in writing or by telephone and other wire communication means. It was high time to switch to operational command by radio and a system of concise battle orders, or to control from the saddle, as cavalrymen were fond of saying in those days. In the tactical training of all echelons of divisional and regimental command personnel, we aimed to teach them the skill of. I still remember an interesting bilateral war game we held in 1933. The defender was Muzichenko's reinforced 21st Regiment, which was given 2 days to build a defence line over the entire tactical depth. The 20th Regiment, the attacking side, had no inkling of the pending exercise or of the field defences the 21st Regiment was organising. It was alerted suddenly. In the jumping-off area, the 20th was joined by reinforcing units, a tank squadron and a howitzer battalion. Here the regimental command was filled in on the tactical situation, which called for immediate action. The 20th was required to make a 46-kilometre forced march as the forward unit of the division and to capture the bridgehead where the 21st Regiment had dug in. Towards sunset, the advance guard of the 20th Cavalry Regiment engaged the combat outposts of the 21st. Since the 20th had not managed to reconnoitre the enemy defences before nightfall, its commander, V.V. Kryukov, resolved to do this overnight and attack at dawn. Indeed, this was the only possible decision. Past experience shows that the outcome of a battle depends, in the final analysis, on how well, precisely and attentively, the commanding officer and his staff organize the attack. Intelligence is of paramount importance in this intricate effort. When one is aware of enemy dispositions, strength, resources, and the specific features of enemy-held terrain, one can forecast the enemy's reaction unerringly. I know from my own experience how crucial thorough reconnaissance is, especially if the attack is due at dawn, as during the night the enemy may easily change his dispositions under cover of darkness. Reconnaissance is even more essential when one faces a battle-hardened adversary. Kryukov, commander of the 20th Regiment, naturally understood this theory, but committed an impermissible error by overlooking the fact that the enemy also had a mission: to check the enemy's breakthrough and destroy him if possible. Muzichenko, commander of the 21st Cavalry Regiment, decided to repel enemy breakthrough attempts with fire from both his forward line of defence and his artillery, thus preventing the enemy from wedging into his front-line position. Secondly, under cover of the din of battle and in complete secrecy, he planned to withdraw to his preconceived and prepared second line of defence after darkness fell. Thirdly, he intended to withdraw his men from the first trench of his regiment's front line just before dawn, so that the enemy would not discover his manoeuvre, leaving reconnaissance patrols to report on the enemy's movements. As soon as darkness set in, the commander of the 20th Regiment dispatched reinforced reconnaissance patrols to the enemy's forward line of defence. They were met with fire, took cover in front of the barbed wire, and began studying the situation. Throughout the night, the commander of the 20th received regular reports that the enemy still held the first trench and was even trying to capture prisoners. Kryukov was sure the enemy had dug in and would defend his positions. At daybreak, after a shelling, the regimental commander, anticipating an easy victory, fired flares to start the attack. The shelling was intensified, and a vigorous assault was launched. Tanks rolled across the first-line trenches at high speed and broke into the second line. The first trench was taken. Then, all of a sudden, the tanks halted. "Comrade Divisional Commander," the commander of the 20th Regiment addressed the supervisor of the exercises, "permit me to go and see for myself why the attacking lines have halted." He was given permission and, in the second line of trenches, found Bush, the commander of the 2nd Squadron, of whom he inquired why they had halted. "We're wondering with the tank squadron commander what to do next." "Crush the enemy, that's what!" Kryukov cried. "But there is no enemy here." Kryukov was startled. Where has he got to? All night, reconnaissance reported that the enemy had dug in. A mediator tankman told the regimental commander a note had been found that may explain matters. The regimental commander took the note and read, "Greetings, you can whistle for us. Next time keep your eyes peeled." One should have seen the consternation written on every face, the awkwardness felt over the successful ruse of the 21st Regiment, which had made the attackers waste their ammunition. Furthermore, they had not the faintest idea of the enemy's whereabouts. "Muzichenko has pulled one over on you," Kostenko, the senior mediator attached to the 20th Regiment, observed caustically. "Could be worse," Kryukov said, as he examined his map and peered at the terrain up in front. At this very moment, as if confirming his words, the mediators noted an artillery strike at the halted line of the 20th Regiment. That was the last straw. The exercise was analysed in full detail. Special note was made of the blunders committed by the 20th Regiment, which had been guilty of inexcusable passiveness in reconnoitring the enemy. The operations of the 21st Regiment, on the other hand, were commended as a model for deceptive moves. All participants in this exercise retained lasting memories of it, and it was repeated in various modifications time and again. Special heed was paid in troop training to the ability to determine aims and tasks in intricate conditions. What did we do? I usually kept the point of the exercise under my hat. The regiment in training was alerted and assigned a concentration area. There its command was filled in on the tactical situation, and given its battle orders that required manoeuvring across hard-to-cross marshy or wooded terrain. It needed much clearing and laying of roads and crossings from material at hand. As a rule, no engineer support was given, so as to accustom all command echelons to drawing upon their own resources. Physically, these exercises were most grueling. Sometimes the men would be literally on their last legs, going without sleep and proper meals for several days running. But how happy they were when their unit coped with some formidable assignment and reached the set goal. Next time, finding themselves in grim conditions, they knew they would achieve their mission. In this way, the command personnel and the men acquired skills that enabled them to creditably fulfill every assignment. The comradely get-togethers which the political workers arranged after such exercises helped to instill valuable moral qualities in the commanders and men. The participants in the field exercises aired their views, discussed faults, and held up to good-humoured ridicule all who had added to the difficulties by negligence or indifference, or who had thrown in the towel in the face of obstacles. Thanks to the efforts of all the men in the division, the construction work was completed in 1935. All units were now well quartered and had good training facilities. The complement of horses was also much better. The division had made good headway in every aspect of political and combat training. Discipline was good, as was the general organizational setup of the various units. The year 1935 abounded in happy events. In the first place, at inspection reviews, all of the units were commended, even in so difficult an aspect of cavalry training as firing. In the second place, the division was awarded the highest governmental distinction, the Order of Lenin, for good progress in overall combat training. A number of officers, NCOs and privates were likewise decorated. I myself, as commander of the division, received the Order of Lenin. I was deeply moved and wanted to do more to raise morale and the standard of training to a still higher level. That year is remembered by US military men because the party took another measure to raise the authority of the commanding personnel. It introduced personal military ranks. The first marshals of the Soviet Union were V.K. Blucher, S.M. Budeny, K.Y. Voroshilov, A.I. Yegorov, and M.N. Tukhachevsky. A big event for us was Budeny's visit to our division. He came to inspect us and to see the progress we were making, especially in horsemanship, drill, and tactical training. He rated all exercises highly, which reaffirmed the fine standard of training reached. For the ceremony at which the division was to receive the Order of Lenin, the cavalry were drawn up in parade formation on one of the city squares. The men were in high spirits. On the flanks of each of the units, the banners under which our veterans had fought the White Guards and Polish gentry waved in the breeze. The General's March was played, the ceremonial report was given, and a solemn hush descended as Budeny mounted the platform. He signalled to me and my two assistants to ride up with the divisional colours. He pinned the Order of Lenin to them, and lifting them high, we galloped past the ranks. There were cheers, and an artillery salvo thundered. This expressed the men's hearty gratitude to the party and government for this high reward in peacetime military training. We could see that Budeny was deeply moved as he prepared to address the division. Small wonder, too, since this division, which he himself had reared, was now getting the country's highest distinction. I must note that our cavalrymen, especially those who had gone through the Civil War with him, looked up to Budeny with great respect. Budeny said many warm words to us. Then I spoke on behalf of the men, asking Budeny to tell the Party Central Committee and the government that our 4th Division would cherish and multiply its martial traditions and would always be prepared to fulfill any assignment the country may have for it. The day wound up with a ceremonial march past of the entire division. After the parade, I gave a banquet at which Budeny and veterans of the 1st Mounted Army reminisced about the Civil War and those plucky comrades who had not lived to see the present. The best raconteur was Vasily Novikov, the commanding officer of the 4th Mechanized Regiment, whose amazing memory had retained even the slightest details of army life. Subsequently, while I was still in command of the 4th Division, Budeny visited us another 3 times, each visit occasioning the entire personnel the greatest delight. I must say that Boudeni certainly knew how to talk with the commanders and men, though of course he did not conduct any exercises or games in person. No one thought any the worse of him for that. We were also visited several times by I.P. Uborovich, commander of the Byelorussian military district. He was a fine Soviet general who had mastered tactics and strategy to his fingertips. He would turn up when least expected, and each time he came, the men would be alerted, and at the end there would be tactical exercises or commanders' drills. He first visited us in 1934, telling me that he had come to see how the division was faring. I said I was very happy to see him, though, frankly speaking, I felt excited. "I'll give you 4 hours," he said, "to take the 21st Regiment out for field exercises to show what progress the division has made." He added, "I'm giving you a free hand. I will be expecting your aid at the HQ of the 4th Rifle Division." "It's too little time to organize a tactical exercise properly," I tried to object. "There won't be enough time even to brief the mediators or designate the enemy." "I agree," Uborovich said, "but anything can happen in the army." I realized that remonstrance was pointless and action was called for. I telephoned Muzichenko, commander of the 21st Cavalry Regiment, and gave him the passwords for the training alert and the starting position. I also dictated to him a short tactical assignment. While the assignment was being typed, the divisional chief of staff and his assistants quickly prepared operations maps and then took them personally to the commanding officer of the 21st Regiment. By the appointed hour, everything was ready. Uborovich and the aide I had sent for him arrived at the starting position 4 hours later on the dot. He greeted Muzichenko and asked him for a summary of the situation and what he intended doing about it. Muzichenko did this very capably, and by the smile on Uborovich's face, I could see that he was satisfied with the beginning of the exercise. "Well, boots and saddles," he said. "Let's see the regiment in action." The exercise took 5 hours. In this time, Uborovich had a look at all the detachments of the regiment, which operated as the divisional vanguard. He did more than 80 kilometers on horseback and, evidently tired, ordered the exercise to end. After an analysis, which I gave straight on horseback in front of the lined-up regiment, Uborovich made a brief speech of thanks. Parting with the divisional staff, he said, "Your training is quite on a par with modern standards. I wish you all the best. I cannot stay since I am in a hurry to get to the frontier, but I promise to call on you before the manoeuvres." We were pleased with the results of the exercise and, frankly speaking, were glad that Uborovich had no more time to stay with us. In 1935, the 4th Cavalry Division was transferred from the 3rd Cavalry Corps to the 6th Cossack Corps, which was put under the command of E.I. Goryachev. In April 1936, it was renamed the 4th Don Cossack Division, and all its commanders and men changed into Cossack uniforms. I have had occasion to take part in many district manoeuvres. The big district manoeuvres were of particular value for the experience I gained in the tactical direction of operations. You've got to hand it to Uborovich, his Chief of Staff B.I. Bobrov, his Combat Training Department Chief N.A. Shumovich, and his entire staff generally. They were most expert in bringing home the lesson of the manoeuvres they organized, conducting them, and then analyzing the results. I remember the 1936 manoeuvres very well, especially the forcing of the Berezina, the river on which Napoleon lost the remnants of his army retreating from Russia in 1812. We knew that the People's Commissar for Defense Voroshilov and other military leaders attended, and it was only natural for every unit and formation to anticipate a personal visit from Voroshilov. We of the 4th Cossack Division took it for granted that he would come to see us, but we did not know when. We hoped he would come while the weather still held, and we would all look spruce and neat. Unfortunately, as is often the case in autumn, rainy weather set in. Having completed the deployment of divisional units in the vicinity of the river crossing, where they were well concealed in the forests 4 or 5 kilometers away from the river, we summoned the commanders to the command post to verbally instruct them on tactical coordination with neighbouring units after forcing the river. The maps were barely spread out when a string of cars drove up. Voroshilov, Shaposhnikov, and Uborovich alighted from the first car. I reported to Voroshilov, briefly noting that the 4th Division was prepared to force the river and that the unit commanders had been summoned for a final briefing. "Fine," Voroshilov said. "We'll listen in." He wanted to know how our BT-5 tanks would force the river under their own power if they submerged. After a circumstantial report by the commander of the mechanized regiment, Voroshilov addressed commanders and commissars he had known from the 1st Mounted Army. "How greatly has our cavalry changed!" he exclaimed. "During the Civil War, all that Boudeni and I had in our mounted army were a few primitive armoured cars. Today, every cavalry division has a regiment of fine tanks that can take a formidable river under their own power. What, old buddy, do you think about our tanks?" Voroshilov turned to Kostenko. "Will they let us down, or is a horse more dependable?" "No," Kostenko said. "Though it's too early to give up horse, sabre and lance, they can still do good service. We are paying great heed to tanks as a new mobile arm of our troops." "And what does your commissar think?" Voroshilov asked Zinchenko, whom he also knew from 1st Mounted Army days. "In my opinion, Kostenko's right," Zinchenko said, adding, "I would certainly be a poor, in fact an absolutely inefficient commissar of a mechanized regiment if I questioned the great future of armour. I think we must build up our mechanized forces on a greater scale, and especially tank formations, of which we have too few." "Very good," Voroshilov said. Then, addressing those who accompanied him, he said, "Let's not take up any more of the division's time. All the best, we'll get together again and talk." We understood that Voroshilov would personally observe the forcing of the river as the motorcade headed for the scene of our future action. After half an hour of artillery shelling, our advance units approached the riverbank along a broad front. A low-flying aircraft put out a smoke screen, concealing the advance landing party from the enemy. As the smoke began to clear, the advance force had already gained a foothold on the opposite bank. Here and there shouts of "Hurrah!" the staccato of rifle and machine gun fire and artillery firing were heard. And when the smoke lifted completely, we got a clear view of 15 tanks from the mechanized regiment roaring up the enemy bank, their guns firing and speeding to support the units continuing the assault from the captured bridgehead. Soon the entire division was on the other bank, and, driving the enemy before it, advanced with fair success. At the analysis, Voroshilov praised the good organization of the river crossing and the tankmen's daring to ford so deep a river as the Berezina under their own power. We passed down the commendation at regimental assemblies. The men would not disperse for a long time, jubilantly discussing the highlights of the exercise. A parade was held the next morning. The weather was glorious, the sunshine seeming to warm our hearts in a special way. The troops that had taken part in the district manoeuvres were lined up and waited for the order to come to attention and greet the People's Commissar for defence. It seemed to me as if the command personnel of my 4th Don Cossack Division were more excited than the rest. I looked again and saw calm and confident faces. In the midst of these reflections, I heard the command, "Attention, eyes right," as the People's Commissar for Defence rode up. Uborovich, the district commander, briefly reported, and Voroshilov galloped off to inspect the troops. First he went to the infantry. The divisional band struck up the general's march. Astride a lively chestnut, Voroshilov rode up to our division, checking his mount in front of the 19th Manich Regiment, the outfit he had led more than once into battle against White Guard and White Polish troops. He greeted the men with special warmth as he glanced at the ranks. After reviewing the 4th Division, Voroshilov galloped off to inspect the 6th Chongar Cossack Division, which had also covered itself with glory during the Civil War. It had fought well shoulder to shoulder with our own division under the colours of the 1st Mounted Army. Following this, Voroshilov ascended the platform to deliver a speech in which he briefly dwelt on the policies and measures adopted by the party in socialist construction, referred to the international situation, emphasized the need for stronger defences, and congratulated the troops on the successful autumn manoeuvres. The band then struck up, and the infantry trooped by, followed by the cavalry. At parades, as a rule, the cavalry kept to a trot. However, this time we got Uborovich to agree to a canter. However, it so happened that passing the reviewing stand, the cavalry broke into a fast gallop, while the column of machine-gun carriages which followed the horsemen dashed by in full career. Corps Commander S.K. Timoshenko was worried and shot glances at me, but there was nothing at all that I could do at that point. The machine-gun carriages whizzed by like arrows from a bow. We were afraid that a wheel might come off, as this sometimes happened at parades even in Moscow. I stole a look at Voroshilov and was relieved to see that his face was wreathed in smiles as he waved in greeting to the division's daredevil machine-gunners. The 4th Don Cossack Division participated in all district manoeuvres down the years. It was invariably well prepared and always earned praise from the higher command. I want to describe one of the exercises we had shortly before the manoeuvres. Conducted in the vicinity of Slutsk under Uborovich and his deputy, Timoshenko, the exercise was a meeting engagement between a rifle division and a cavalry division. In those days, a rifle division had already become a well-equipped combat formation. While 10 years earlier it had 12,800 men, 54 artillery pieces, 189 heavy and 81 light machine guns, and not a single tank or anti-aircraft weapon, a rifle division in 1935 had about the same strength plus 57 tanks, up to 100 artillery pieces, 180 heavy and over 350 light machine guns, and 18 anti-aircraft machine guns.